Hello. Before we get to the stories, I'd like to give a shout out to the Stranger Happenings podcast, where you can find everything strange and unusual. You can find them on Apple, Spotify, Google, and more. Now, on to the stories. I was 15. My family and I were in Fort Myers, Florida, and there was a terrible storm on the horizon, riding in on black clouds. The waves had begun crashing like a watery bulldozer, and the sea was becoming choppy. I was boogie boarding, and I went out for one last wave. Something very cold bumped into my legs. Seconds later, I went under. In this moment, I was like a boiled crab getting my leg ripped by a hungry restaurant patron. Simultaneously screaming and inhaling copious amounts of salt water, I could feel something of great strength tugging me along as the sand I clawed at began to fall away from my fingertips. Something tangible and icy was wrapped around my ankle. This is a moment that I realized, amidst the struggling, that it wasn't a riptide. Something had a hold of my leg, and it was dragging me further and further from land. When I couldn't hold my breath any longer, my fight or flight kicked in. Instead of swimming away from whatever it was, I swam along with it. My head broke above the surface one time as I projectile vomited salt and took one more deep inhale, and yet I was dragged down again. Now facing the horizon, I felt the same snug, icy grip, only now on my forearm, and it continued to pull. I'd assumed I was being pulled by a giant squid, but then I opened my eyes, and what I saw was nightmarish. I was leering directly into the eyes of a little boy with dark blue lips, a pale bluish tint to his skin, and his jaw hanging open, like the corpse of a drowning victim. His bony fingers were latched to my forearms while gazing into my soul with dead, lifeless white eyes. This boy was miraculously swimming backwards while simultaneously pulling me to my death. Utterly frightening was the vision of his legs paddling eerily sluggish behind him while swimming in the wrong direction. I pushed my feet against his chest and shot myself away and out of his grasp. The last thing I saw was the boy reaching for my legs while receding down into the black abyss, smiling at me with a toothless grin on his way down. I shuddered when I heard a humming of what sounded like some sort of demonic lullaby after he disappeared, emanating from all around me in echoes. Once my head broke the surface and I began taking giant breaths, my eyes adjusted and I discovered that I was maybe only 100 yards from shore. I swam as hard and fast as I could, but fighting exhaustion, I figured I wouldn't make it until my feet touched down on the sandbar, the waves violently crashing around me and thunder rumbling overhead. I took a minute to breathe. I told my parents what happened, that it was a boy, a very evil boy, who pulled me under. My dad says, sometimes in a stressful situation, you'll imagine things that aren't there. He never went against his conviction that I imagined it, but I saw it in his face the next morning. Pure dread in his eyes when I showed him freezer burns on my wrists and ankles in the shape of fingers. Somehow, I believe that many of those who have drowned from undertows were really drowned by something else. They just aren't alive to tell us about it. Yesterday, I saw something strange. Now, I've known the ocean is a mysterious place. We may know what's in it, but we've never explored far enough to see the whole picture. The thing I saw out from my house on a hill was insanity. It was a shape thought to be almost impossible in nature, that I thought it would have been man-made. It still boggles my mind to remember how the waves crashed to the shore in a perfect square. It was certainly a sight to behold in the moment, but I could still feel an awful dread settling into me as I peeked at it through a sliver of an opening in the curtain. I knew well enough that everything beautiful in the sea had a sort of darkness to it, capable of bringing despair to anyone. 3 hours had passed, and I still saw it. Square-shaped waves that seemed to beckon onlookers to jump in. It seemed so gentle and yet deadly in its persistence. I couldn't help but wonder if some monster lurked beneath the surface, looking to feast on anyone unlucky to wade in. Now, I pride myself on never losing myself to the ridiculousness of believing in sea monsters and awful megalodon still exist theorist. But that thing, it terrified me. How it could pull at my desire for exploration, but fill me with terror at the thought of following through. It was a death sentence. And that was when I saw my neighbor. He was out on the shore staring at the incomprehensible with a look of amusement, like it was just a game that had no cost. But I couldn't yell out, as my fear kept me numb and unable to speak. My neighbor waded in, completely oblivious to the fact that he made a grave mistake. But nothing happened. I watched with relief as my neighbor pushed forward, calmly swimming through the waves. For a moment, I thought I had overreacted. It took just 10 minutes to know how wrong I was. There wasn't even a scream of terror or a shout for help. It was just a second of his head above water before he had slipped below the depths in an instant. It was so sudden, so vicious in its cruelty. But one thing was for certain. I could only watch in horror as a man was sucked right down to an unknown depth. I don't know what caught on to him, if a monster lurked beneath the waves, slinking a tentacle around his oblivious feet. But one thing was for sure. I never saw that man again. I was terrified of the creature, practically imagining glowing red eyes that glimmered from beneath the odd shape. I can feel its eyes even now, when the strange shape disappeared, leaving nothing but emptiness. I can't leave my house. The monster is still lurking there, I know it. It was either that or realizing that the greatest horror on earth is Mother Nature itself. The Colchester slowly made its way north, bobbing up and down in the small swells left over from last night's storm. The Colchester was a large cargo ship. She had been made to cross the Atlantic and make occasional trips around South Africa and into the Arabian Sea. She was currently making her way through the Davis Strait, in between Greenland and the northwestern passages of Canada. Brian Altier made his way forward along the port bow. He took his time, inspecting the cargo rigging as he went. Brian wrote down everything in his log: the condition of the cargo, the state of the rigging, and anything else he might notice along the way. When he was finished with his rounds, he would make his report to the captain, as he always did. Brian had finally made his way to the bow. He stood there for a long while, just staring off into the distance and feeling the salty spray against his cheeks. It was at times like these that he often remembered the good old days, the loud, boisterous crew, and the many adventures they had. To some, shipping freight was boring, but Brian loved being on the open sea. It was his true calling in life. He just wished that the old crew was here to enjoy it with him, like in the old days. Brian sat at the stern and ate his lunch, as he always did. It was evening and quickly approaching night when Brian was finally finished with his rounds. He made one final notation in his log and went to make his report to the captain. Brian headed to the mess to see if he might find the captain sitting down for dinner. But when he got there, it was completely empty, not a soul in sight. So Brian made his way to the captain's quarters. The captain needed to hear his report, but the captain's quarters were completely empty. After another futile search, Brian gave up. He went to his own quarters and lay down to go to sleep, as he always did. 3 different fishermen had called in reports within an hour. The Coast Guard arrived and began a search, but this wasn't the first time, and they didn't expect to find anything. Reports had been coming in for years of people seeing the Colchester drifting by with a man standing at the bow. They searched for 2 hours by sea and air. They never found a thing. Brian awoke to a crisp and clear day. He pulled on his boots, checked himself in the mirror, and grabbed his log. Brian headed out to the port bow and started slowly making his way forward, inspecting the cargo and the rigging as he went, as he always did. His name was Nevarre Cooper. There was no foul play that caused his fall from the ship, and there were no witnesses to the accident. Once in the water, he swam with all his might, and the vigor allowed by the panic of his instinct to keep up. But that was impossible. He screamed over and again, "Help! Help me!" to the fullness of his lungs, but no one heard him. The ship did not slow or change course. Finally, he sat bobbing in the water, watching the lights grow dimmer, his face flickering, his body swishing around, looking for land where the night sky met the ocean, but there was none. He did not face death well, not in the way a deer might lay down in the victor's jaws and accept its fate. He considered every possible strategy, such as trying to float on his back for the longest possible time, swimming in the boat's direction at a steady pace, trying to determine where land might be, looking for jetsam to cling to. But after cycling through these hopeless options, a pitiful whimper started to rise up from his chest. Without control, it quickly broke into a guttural sob. He screamed and wept tears and mucus that mixed with the salty ocean. He was thinking about his children, his young girls who would miss him and always wonder where Daddy went. This in particular was the most searing of pain for him. He took the Lord's name in vain, crying out, "God! Jesus!" as he wept, and common curse words like fuck. After 2 hours, becoming thoroughly depleted, Mr. Cooper was nearing his body's limit. But he did spastically attempt to reject death once more, thinking not to give up, as long as there's an ounce of life left in me, or something along those lines. He curried power to thrash about in the waters for a few seconds longer before finally succumbing and falling beneath the surface. Some 20 feet under, he watched the last of the air release from his lungs, the bubbles rising to the surface. It was poignant, like a ghostly figure, a symbol of his very life drifting away from him. A memory then arose of his 2 young girls, happily dancing with him during a gleeful moment of play. This brought a great bout of agony, causing his body to retch and sucking in ocean water to fill his lungs. His vision went black, and soon all that remained was a soulless, drifting carcass. I hope that this recounting of Mr. Cooper's terror finds you well and will leave you sated, my Lord Abaddon. I try to include some more colorful elements, as you have wished, without venturing too far into interpretation. Furthermore, and as always, I assure you that nothing was done to ease the man's suffering. I stand awaiting further assignments. In your bondage, nameless, number 486028468. You can sometimes see ghosts underwater. Not many, and not often, but sometimes, like when you're walking from one station to another, or when you're peering through a porthole, trying to catch a glimpse of the fish. They'll be standing outside. Yes, I didn't say floating or swimming. Standing. Both feet on the ocean floor, planted firmly, as if they're just standing on your front lawn. But they're not standing on the surface. They're stuck down here with the rest of us in the dark. You might be wondering, dear listener, how there can be ghosts underwater. I would also like to ask them that question. But they can't answer. We're underwater, and you can't talk underwater. The second you open your mouth, water will rush in, and your lungs will be filled with its burning volume. You've drowned. They can't drown. They're already dead. That's probably why they're down here. Ships lost, sailors lost, souls lost, lost to the depths. The dark, the darkness. If you see one, you'll know. They don't just stand there. They glow, bright like moonlight, like the bulbs of anglerfish, heavenly among the pitch-black nothingness outside. They're far enough away that the automatic perimeter sensors aren't triggered. Filming them is equally as useless. Nothing works when they're around. Nothing works. Nothing. Including the oxygen systems. And that's the point, isn't it? The reason why they're starting to appear more and more frequently. They've had enough of just looking at us. They want to be able to touch us.